everyone, and welcome to the Master Series, your guide to intelligent production, brought to you by Entertainment Partners. I'm your host, Natalie Nelson. In the Master Series, we address the important issues impacting the entertainment industry and its workers through in-depth discussions with legal, tax, payroll, technology, and production experts. And today, our expert panel will be discussing Australia's recently ratified 30% location offset and how domestic and international productions can both benefit from this and other programs available in Australia. Two quick housekeeping items as we get started today. First, we encourage you to join the conversation by posting questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. You can do so by simply clicking the Q&A icon in the Zoom navigation menu. Also, please take a few minutes after our webinar today to answer a short feedback survey. This gives you an opportunity to give us feedback about today's topic, as well as suggest topics for future webinars. Your feedback is always important to us, and we thank you for it. Now, I am pleased to introduce our panel. Today, we are joined by executive producer Ben Grant. With over 30 years of experience in the screen sector, Ben's career has spanned from accountant to his current role as producer at Goalpost Pictures in Australia. At Goalpost, Ben has been involved in numerous productions, overseeing total costs of nearly $200 million, including successful films such as The Sapphires and The Invisible Man, as well as beloved TV shows like Cleverman and Black Snow. Ben is experienced in both the financial and legal aspects of production, including contractual negotiations with distributors and broadcasters. He has adapted to this shifting landscape of the industry from analog to digital platforms and has a deep understanding of the Australian incentives, both at the federal and state levels. During his involvement with Australia's Producers Guild, Screen Producers Australia, Ben has participated in industry negotiations with the Cast and Crew Union and is currently serving on the committee negotiating with the MEAA for a newly updated crew agreement. Ben has been a member of the Film Certification Board for the past 9 years, where he provides advice to the Minister for the Arts on applications for the location and the PDV offsets. Possessing a deep understanding of these incentives, including the department's guidelines and various types of content produced. Also joining us today is Training Director Jill Hewitt. A veteran of the film industry, Jill's career has spanned 30 years, specializing in production accounting. Her expertise she has provided clients as a member of the Moneypenny Group since 1989, and now offers to global clients following EP's acquisition of Moneypenny in 2022. Starting out as an accountant's assistant, Jill worked her way up to be the production accountant and financial controller on films such as Muriel's Wedding, Paradise Road, Oscar and Lucinda, and Moulin Rouge. As training director at Entertainment Partners, her role as mentor to emerging accountants has expanded to help solve the critical shortage of production accountants and assistants that the industry now faces. Today, in her role, she runs both short and long courses for AFTRS and ACE, a recent partnership with Netflix, and other independent training bodies, setting up new productions to succeed with the right teams and mentoring candidates who wish to step up into the financial controller position. Also with us today is Tracey Hill, an experienced production accountant whose notable credits include Black Snow 2, Ticket to Paradise, Wizards, and True Spirit. Tracey brings to her role an extensive knowledge and expertise in budgeting, planning, and financial reporting. Her professional experience prior to the film industry spanned roles including commercial, financial, and labor analyst, budgeting and financial planning manager, finance director, treasury manager, management accountant, and university lecturer. Among Tracey's key skills are managing investments by maximizing rebate revenue linked with strong financial controls, processes, and costs, while building relationships with key stakeholders. She has worked in positions globally, including in South Africa, Ireland, Australia, and Samoa. Also with us today is Kat Slowik, Finance and Operations Director at Entertainment Partners. Kat has over 20 years of experience in the industry managing production budgets and facilitation of offset rebate applications. She is an experienced general manager in film and television financial services industry and in production accounting educating. She is an expert in establishing accounting functions, systems, and best practices, ensuring projects are on budget and the maximum rebates are achieved. She is also a co-production specialist with experience in all film and television genres. Prior to Entertainment Partners, during her tenure with the Moneypenny Group, Kat's experience ranged across all divisions, gaining essential skills to meet the ever-evolving needs of the film industry. And finally, moderating today's discussion is our production incentives expert, Joe Chianese, Senior Vice President and Production Incentives Practice Leader here at Entertainment Partners. At Entertainment Partners, Joe provides production and legislative consulting, financial, tax, and administrative services for domestic and international production incentives. He has over 35 years of accounting, government affairs, production incentive, and tax experience, and he has held positions at Sony Pictures Entertainment, the Walt Disney Company, ABC Television Network, Paramount Pictures, and Ernst & Young. All right, panelists, it is wonderful to see you today. Thank you for joining us from across the globe. I know we have a few different geographies represented. So, Joe, I know we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. And yes, we do have a lot to cover. And I'll just kick it off. I always like to start off with sort of the state of the industry, both from a U.S. and a worldwide perspective. And I think most of what I'm going to say is probably things we already know. With the strikes or the risk of strikes behind us, production just hasn't rebounded to the levels the industry was expecting. And it's everywhere. It's not just here in Los Angeles or in the US. It's really an industry issue, whether it's industry retraction or the studios and streamers, and many of them are now one and the same, revisiting their business models or things. Things are slow at the moment, but they're really going to come back. But I think the other thing when I hear these comparisons, I think what I see happening is we're comparing now to unprecedented times. We're comparing it to before COVID, where there was a booming stream, right? And then we're comparing it to after COVID, when all of a sudden we had a rebound year. And then there was the strikes. So I think we're definitely at a point in time where everyone's revisiting how they want to move forward. I'll just say from a personal perspective, I would love to see the extension of the theatrical window. I think it would be great to retrain people to go back to the movies. I think it would bring more profit back to the producers, really help independent producers. And hopefully that's what I'll see happening. And we'll talk more about that with our panelists a little bit later. And I'll just say, in addition, the industry's strong. Over this last few years, we're building stronger infrastructure, stages, training more crews. Incentives are strong around the world. We're going to be talking more about Australia in a little bit. And while a lot of people criticize production incentives, I just really want to say that, again, they supplement producers' costs. They allow more content to be made, and ultimately they're job creation programs. So they're very important. So with that said, I really want to jump to our panelists and sort of get that same sense of what's going on in Australia, talking about what were things like before COVID, and then what happened after COVID, and what's happening now, and what we can expect going forward. So I have everyone lined up, but I'm just going to ask Tracey to start first, and then ask the other panelists just to chime in.
Right. Well, before COVID, I live on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and we were incredibly busy, and we managed to maintain that during the COVID period. So that was the impact on us. We had good, steady business coming through.
And what were you saying? Tracey, Jill, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's because Australia had relatively small numbers of COVID compared to the rest of the world. We did have very strict rules, so a lot of productions did continue to work here. In fact, there was one production called Children of the Corn, and they were just about to start filming when all the lockdowns happened, and the line producer, the production accountant resigned the day before shoot. And they called me because all of the accounting tech was on our products. And it was the first job I then was the production accountant on, doing it completely remotely. So we were able to have the bubble of a production operating in a bubble. And I did the complete production accounting remotely. And that was only because all of our products are now allowed us to do it digitally.
But again, going back, so again, we're talking about COVID, which I know, but what about before COVID? Was Australia experiencing that same boom? Because, obviously Netflix was spending a lot of money. The other studios and producers were playing catch up. It was really unprecedented in terms of how much money was being spent and how much production was happening. I have to imagine, given the infrastructure crew and incentives in Australia, that they were really getting a big piece of that.
Yeah, Joe, I think we describe the period leading up to 2020 as a golden age, and actually a golden age in television. So what was actually occurring, I think, is a transition that was brought upon us because of COVID, but a transition away from cinema. So I'm not going to say cinema was dying, but there was a downturn in theatrical exhibition and an upturn in small screen. The streamers were arriving either in force, like Netflix, obviously, FANG, the big ones, Netflix and Amazon. And really, I think the short version of what happened next is COVID allowed us to reset, I think. Some things happened here that were different than the rest of the world. But in summary, as we emerged at the end of 2021 or in 2022, it was enabled us to reset. We opened the front door, we had a look out and went, one, the golden age of television had just, the gloss had come off. The cinemas found it very hard to catch back up, and they, to be honest, exhibition has still not quite caught up. And Jill touched on it. Importantly, we all we learned how to work from home. So many of the roles started to sort of either transition to a full digital age, I guess. And that one in particular is one that stands out, that everyone went, well, I wonder how that role can be performed offsite. And particularly in the case of accounting, we've seen that's been something that's been able to continue.
And I'll just say, shameless EP plug, but EP has a lot of sort of digital products that really did blossom during COVID and allowed the industry to continue remotely. So again, it was something that I don't know if it was really utilized as much pre-COVID, but we were really happy that it was in place and ready to go and heavily utilized during COVID and continues to be utilized. So, but again, I like that term golden age, Ben, whether it's a golden age or a bubble, or, I feel personally, I think things have deflated. I don't think it's popped. I think we're revisiting, the models. I don't think the producers could spend that much anymore, especially relying strictly on a streaming model. With that many streamers out there, there's no way of recouping those costs, which goes back to my original point. I would love to see that theatrical. As a film goer, I love going to the movies. I can't tell you how many movies I have not seen because I really literally hate watching movies at home. I would just love to see a longer theatrical window again. So Kat, let's talk about the strikes. So the strikes, so we had a boom, we had a pandemic, and then we had a rebound, and then we had strikes here in the US. How did those strikes impact Australia?
Domestically, we didn't really see much of a difference. There were a few productions that were a bit wavy, I guess, but got some waivers to be able to continue. There were some international productions that did have to shut down, which was not great. And I'd say also our PDV providers were impacted because that source of projects wasn't coming from the US to us.
And then now we've got the labor unions with all these agreements. Jill, are we seeing any impact in terms of volume of business, or is Australia, like everyone else, sort of in that sort of limbo as we wait for things to sort of reignite?
No, not really, or perhaps a little. Now that the unions have tentatively agreed, it's not the lack of crew that will force the studio's hand to shoot elsewhere, but I think it'll be our tax credits, our incentives, our amazing locations. We have jungle locations, tropical paradise, desert, city landscapes, and even snow. You might not believe that, but we do have snow. The fact that we speak English, we have qualified technicians, and a very weak Australian dollar against the greenback that I think is going to attract people to Australia regardless.
Well, Ben, if you had a crystal ball, where do you see Australia 5 and 10 years from now? I know that, again, the government has been very resourceful in sort of continuing to tweak the offsets to continue to attract the larger productions. And again, we'll talk more about infrastructure and crew, but how do you envision Australia 5 and even 10 years from now?
Well, firstly, I don't have a crystal ball. The main thing, and the main thing I would worry about, and I guess when you're looking at the risk profile, is the exchange rate, and I can't predict that. But yes, currently we are advantageous below 70 cents to the dollar. Look, there's definitely the shift to streamer continues. So the shift, and it may surprise some listening or watching, that we probably 5 years ago, we had a strong free-to-air, so terrestrial television market. Perhaps in 5 to 10 years' time, that would either have disappeared or diminished to a point of being irrelevant. I think that the incentives are solid. So whatever the landscape is, this shift to ratifying the 30% for the location offset, it should give comfort for anyone who's planning, whether it be a 3 or a 5 year, two picture, whatever it is that they might be planning. So there's a solid base there. And I think in one way that probably is evidenced by some activity in the soundstage construction area. There's some here in Sydney, as in plans for new sound stages. I understand there's some in Western Australia, and recently we had another one in Queensland. So they would be the tells that people are actually feeling confident enough to invest in that infrastructure over that period of time.
But you've answered the question exactly the way I was hoping you would, because really why I was asking that question is, producers are looking 5 to 10 years in the future as it relates to stages and crews. So again, we'll talk more about the incentives with CAT, but again, because I don't remember off the top of my head if the Australian offset has a sunset date, but I don't think it does. And so I think, like I said, I want to continue to highlight throughout this hour, the continuing growing infrastructure and stages in the UK, because again, during the boom, Australia, but during the boom and even post-COVID, it was all about, we can't find stages, we can't find crew. So hopefully during this lull, right, we are supplementing the development of stages and, the development of crews as well. And Jill's going to be talking more about the training requirements and options in Australia. So
you did touch on the crew there, Joe, and I guess the last piece of that 5 to 10 year crystal ball. Australia has a finite population. I don't actually see that population increasing dramatically. So the risk or the importance is on the training or on increasing the number of technical crew, especially in the HOD and in identified roles. And I think that the triggers within the location offset are an intelligent or a clever way of doing that, to be honest. And we can talk about that more later.
Sure. And again, as we talk about different types of projects that qualify, I'm going to have Kat go through that in a minute. I always ask about independent production because I also feel, and I heard this during the Cannes Film Festival, that we are potentially going to see a resurgence of the independent producer. I think the big issue there is distribution, where before we talked about how theatrical has dwindled and we really don't have a home entertainment market anymore other than streaming. So before all that, the independents had theatrical and then the DVD market. So I think that's the big issue for independents. But how significant is the indie production market in Australia? Jill, is that something you want to chat about? You can?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, independent productions make the majority of content here in Australia. There's not a huge studio presence here. And most of these productions, well, in fact, Ben is an independent production company. Most of these productions that have had significant government funding, and therefore there's very strict reporting requirements. So anyone that's had their apprenticeship on these shows have learned to be very mindful of compliance and the budget, and have had to have a high degree of critical thinking. So it makes these productions a perfect breeding ground for well-rounded employees. However, now a lot of these independent producers are entering into various sorts of partnerships with studios.
And Kat, we're going to give a deeper dive on the offsets in a minute, but maybe can you just sort of rattle off what type of productions would qualify for the offsets?
Sure.
Because I know one of the things I wanted to bring up, because I've read that we're going to see a lot more unscripted happening even with the streamers, because obviously they're less expensive.
Yeah, so the location and PDV offsets pretty much mirror each other in terms of what formats are eligible. So feature films are eligible, but not feature documentaries. Miniseries, TV series, those kind of projects are all eligible under the location and PDV. But things like quiz shows, game shows, training videos, none of those would be eligible under that. The producer offset is slightly different in that it does allow feature documentaries and feature films, TV series, miniseries, but again, doesn't allow those quiz shows or game shows. The other significant difference is that under the location and PDV offset, reality and unscripted does qualify, but for the producer offset, it doesn't.
So, Tracey, we've been talking about the importance of training. And again, Jill's going to go through it as it relates to the offsets, but maybe you could just tell us a little about your background before coming into the film industry, and how training sets you up for success.
Yes, so my background has been mostly in financial management and accounting. I've also done a bit of university lecturing, and I had the great opportunity to work on a small feature film with a private investor, first-time producer, and we shot that film, and it was at that point that I decided this was the industry I'd love to go into, and explore and work on bigger features. And I then looked at what sort of resources were specifically designed to embrace a production accounting role. And that's when I signed up to an Australian Film, Television, Radio School course on production accounting. And that was my entrance and opportunity to explore this environment. And with that training was incredible. And we'll speak a bit more about it later, but it definitely has opened doors where I've been able to work across feature, docos, TV series, and more recently in reality.
That's great. So before we dive into the offsets, I just want to ask Ben, because I deal with these questions quite a bit. So I'm a U.S. or non-resident producer thinking about going to Australia. What can I do? What do I have to do? Do I have to work through an Australian production services company? Do I need one? Do I set up my own company? What's the typical way? And I know it would vary if you're a larger producer versus a smaller producer.
Look, it does vary, but in essence, it's the same for everyone. To be an eligible applicant, you need to be an Australian entity, an Australian company. Now, you, Joe, could come here and incorporate your Australian company. Or I guess you could get me to do it for you. There are some practical things that you need to work through. So I guess at the head of all this, you need to plan really well. Like if you are, perhaps you're based in Los Angeles or London and you're considering, should I go to Canada or Australia? If you're considering Australia or Canada, I mean, there are some things that you're going to go through that list of, how will I get a schedule? How will I get a budget? Who will be the first people that I will bring into my team to begin that process? Now, you could either do that yourself and fly out here and go into the great unknown, or you could partner with somebody here on the ground. And to be honest, there's no there's no single answer to that, other than to be eligible to apply and be successful with the incentive. It requires that there be an Australian company.
And the reason I ask, I've been reading and just seeing a lot of new companies popping up, sort of full service production services companies. I just didn't know whether or not they were there just to provide production management, or are they really sort of providing crews, or again, I guess the real question for the audience is, are they needed? And the question is, it depends.
Well, it depends on who you are. Like,
right.
If you're the type of person that likes that one-on-one, wants to be able to look the other person in the eye, shake their hand, know that that your outcome is going to be certain and that you're aware of the risks along the way, or if you want to have a more structured entity do that, like a service company, that is the only thing they do. I mean, one of the considerations is that, do you want anyone else creatively involved in your project, or do you not? Right. Are you a control freak or are you not? Do you have other contractual obligations that may benefit one way or the other? So I think there are service companies here that specifically are able to help, and then there are also individuals or individual producers or indie producers, I think you described them as, that may consider either advising or enabling.
Well, that's helpful. We're going to have Kat go into the offsets in a second. I just want to bring up, because you mentioned Canada. We all know that when producers are thinking about a production, going back to my days at Sony, they would do 2 or 3 budgets, right? Now they're doing 5 or 10 budgets based on different locations. And the one thing I continue to highlight is that, as good as Canada is and its great programs, one thing they don't allow are non-residents. And that's a big component. And it's something that Australia does allow. Another thing that's important about Australia is the allowance of ATL, which again is a big reason why places like Georgia in the U.S. are very busy. So, but I wanted Kat to really do a deeper dive now on the different types of offsets, and just give the particulars so the audience can get a sense of what's available.
Yeah, sure, Joe. So there's 3 federal offsets that we have in Australia. We've got the location incentive, which is for large-scale projects that come to Australia. You need to have a minimum qualifying spend of 20 million, and that is Australian dollars, not US dollars. And then the other offset, other 2 offsets are the PDV and the producer offset. The PDV offset is for post-digital and visual effects components, and there's only a $500,000 minimum for that one. And the producer offset kind of varies. There's a few different minimums there. So for feature films, the minimum is $500,000. For TV series, it's $1 million. So there's all sorts of different minimum requirements there for those 3 different offsets. The producer offset is handled by Screen Australia, while the PDV and location offsets are looked after by the Office of the Arts or the Department of Infrastructure.
And you can do the PD, like I know some places you can't, but in Australia, you can do the post and digital and visual separately. You can just bring only there, right?
Absolutely.
Correct?
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter where you shoot. You can bring that post work to Australia, and we'll happily facilitate that for you. And you can apply for the PDV offset as well.
I also know that there's also the different states within Australia that offer incentives as well. I don't know if you want to just quickly rattle off what they are and maybe highlight the percentages, and most importantly, mention that they can be bundled with the federal incentive.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. So the federal offsets, so the 3 location PDV and producer offset, are exclusive. So those ones can't be bundled. But when you get to the state incentives, which could be a PDV incentive, it could be footloose kind of funding incentive, you can bundle all of those with your federal incentives. So if you're in New South Wales and you're getting your location incentive, that's your 30%, you might then choose to do post in New South Wales. So for that post component, you'll get an extra 10% from the New South Wales state agency to give you 40% on your PDV spend, which is pretty amazing. And pretty much every state or territory has its own incentive. They all vary. They all have different requirements. The post, some of them will allow that offshore spend. So if you've got a crew that are here, a director for more than 14 nights, some of them will allow that to be eligible spend, whereas others don't. So it's really a case by case kind of have a look and see which one suits where you're going to be.
And I think this got fixed in the latest legislation, but were there any special caveats about the ability for streamers to qualify? Was that something that was out there, or was there concern or questions? And I don't think there's any risk about the streamers, but was there some confusion around that in the past?
I'm not sure if there was confusion, but if there was, there's no issue with streamers applying. As Ben has already said, it's about being an eligible entity, and that's having that Australian company in order for your expenses to be incurred through to apply for that offset.
So I always ask this question because, again, every country, every state has a different term. And I'll ask Ben, but Kat, you can answer as well. What is an offset? Is it a rebate? Is it a tax credit? What is an offset?
You want to go, Ben?
I do. Before I get to that, so with the federal offsets, so there's a suite of offsets that Kat just outlined, and then the state incentives. The first biggest difference is that the federal offsets are not capped. So if you came here, theoretically, with James Cameron's $1 billion film there, and it was eligible, then that would be there. The state incentives are planned, I guess, through the state budgets, and from time to time, I believe that they have finite amounts of funds. So that's just something important in your planning, to plan really well. The offset is, as the name implies, an offset in tax obligations to the federal government. Typically, the applicant is a brand new clean skin company, and technically it has no obligations. So once it's confirmed through the audit process and then the tax return that there are no obligations, then the tax return will include a large cheque for 30% of the money you spent in Australia that qualified. Whereas the incentives, it's best to describe them as grants. So the state government, based on either your estimated spend or an agreed spend, will then provide a grant at the end upon audit, but that does not involve any process of a tax return.
And I'll just add to that, sorry if I can, Joe, just that for the state agencies, you do usually need to make sure that you're in touch with them very, very early, and you do need to apply for those in advance. And generally they'll require a footloose component. So you could be shooting in New South Wales, you could be shooting in Queensland. But for the federal incentives, there's no need to apply in advance. You don't need to have a provisional certificate in order to get those rebates.
Also, I'm going to either ask you, Kat, or Ben, just because it's a question that a lot of people ask: how quickly can I get the money back? And I asked that question as it relates to the next question: is how often do you see producers financing their offset up front, especially the independent producers, so they can actually make their project? So let's start with timing first.
Look, how long? To be honest, how long is a piece of string? But I would say that the timing, the person who can make the timing shorter is the producer. So the harder you work at it, the more focused you are. And I become very focused on these things because if the loan is ticking over, then that focuses me on it. But let's be clear, neither the offset or the incentives can be sourced until you complete the project. So you need to actually make the show or the film, and you need to actually complete it. The completion is the key thing. Look, I would say between 6 and 9 months would be a benchmark for receiving either the tax return refund or the incentive. It could be shorter if, you could say between 3 and 9 months, but it just depends on the arrangements, of the particular show. But if you think principal photography to completion, you would roughly say that's going to take, 12 months.
I think that timeline was very reasonable. One of the last point, because I really want to jump to Jill on all the training aspects.
Sorry, Joe, you said essentially, can you bank
yes.
All these things? everything we're describing is coming from sovereign governments. So the federal offsets are as safe as houses. So yes, you can bank them. Normally the process is you would have an opinion letter from a third party, accountant or someone who's going to verify your estimate. On the incentive side, normally for the larger come and film in New South Wales incentive, for example, there would be an agreement. So there's an agreement between you and the screen agency, and that would set out the terms of the spend and then of the grant at the end. The PDVs, I believe, there's letters that set it out, but I've been able to secure cash flow facilities against those arrangements. So I would say yes.
Okay, great. One last point before we have Jill and Tracey talk about training, and I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly, but a lot of times when I'm talking to producers, they hear 30 versus 40%, and they immediately want to do anything possible to get that 40%. And you had said something the other day, and hopefully I'm remembering correctly, that it's not always beneficial to aggressively try to get that 40%. And sometimes you're better off with the location offset. Did I remember that correctly, or am I crazy?
No, you did. And somebody, I think you mentioned above the line or ATL. So one of the key benefits for the location offset is that if you have a marquee actor and you're paying, $10 million to, the time that those services were provided in Australia, it's eligible expenditure. Whereas on the 40% side, it's currently still capped. So there's a cap mechanism on the above the line costs. The main thing about the 40% producer offset rebate is that it is typically for Australian productions. And even though that can be loosely defined, for the people watching, think that you have an Australian writer and director and it's an Australian show or film. If you don't, particularly if you don't have an Australian director, then it's unlikely to be qualifying for that 40%.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Furiosa was a producer offset, and I think Elvis, again, and you can look for those productions and understand why, that they had significant Australian content. And
at the core, they had an Australian director, as did Invisible Man. Lee Winnell is Australian, and therefore that's a good cornerstone in the application.
Right. So, Jill, take us home with the training. This is probably one of the more important elements that we want to highlight here. Just talk about what's offered and what's actually needed.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. So to qualify for the location offset, there is a training element to it that you have to do. So even though the new 30% location offset came in on the 1st of July 23, the training element only came into play from the 1st of July 24. So for the financial year, 1st of July 24 to 30th of June 25, a production must spend 0.5% of the qualifying spend on training, with a cap of Australian dollars 250,000. It's about 160,000 US. For the following financial year, so July 24 to June 25, that will increase to 1% of qualifying spend, and the cap increases as well to 500,000 Australian, which is about 325 US. There's two options as a way to spend that money. So the first option is to directly pay on the show for attachments, interns, mentors, people shadowing other crew, or perhaps courses, first aid, safety, mental health, security, cultural sensitivity training, that kind of thing, plus any of the on costs like office space for the training, equipment that may be required. You are also required, or you may be required, to deliver a report on the details and outcomes per participant. If you can't spend the required value or the cap, you can do a top-up payment of no more than 50% to an eligible provider. And that eligible provider has been defined as an entity that offers tertiary courses, or they are a registered training organisation, something like our Australian Film, Television, Radio School. But it's important to remember that top-up payment that would go to one of those providers is not qualifying spend. So that's the first option, actually spending money on training on the show. Or the second option is to invest in either a long-term training program or invest in permanent film and television infrastructure in Australia. There is no minimum expenditure required for this second piece, but it must be designed to encourage ongoing training that supports the broader Australian screen sector. And it must contribute to alleviating all of the, capacity restraints that we have here.
And we'll talk about what Entertainment Partners offers in this area in terms of courses.
Yeah. Look, we've been training for many, many years. We already provide, as Tracey alluded to earlier, the Australian Film and Television Radio School. We run those courses. So we do a 2-day format and a 5-day format. In fact, we're about to do one in September in Western Australia, which needs some more production accountants over there. We run this several times a year. We also work with ACE, which is the Arts Cultural Exchange, to introduce, technical accounting students, university accounting students to our industry. Those students don't know that our role as a production accountant exists. We then provide avenues for them to get on-the-job training. And then if they show promise and aptitude, we promote them after a couple of years to be a mentored production accountant. So we provide that mentorship. And we have several of those right now working on productions all over Australia.
Tracey, can you just talk about maybe what you found most helpful in the courses? Because again, you're sort of our representative of someone who's gone through the process.
Sure. Look, I found the course incredibly powerful because it focused on every single area that a production accountant is involved in, but it also expanded to the life cycle of a film. So it covered, raising the finances. What does pre look like? What is putting together a budget? What is the cash flow like? Taking it through to shoot and then post and the rebate application. And when I walked away from that, I realized you have to begin with the end in mind. So if you know what rebate application you're going to be involved in, what your film or your TV series or, what your project is going for, you make sure at day one that you have all the systems in place to account for what sort of reporting and auditing you're going to have at the end, because then you're able to make sure everything is accurate. There's less questions. There's less toing and froing with the rebate questions that come from Screen Australia. So you want to minimize that so that you can have a quicker turnaround for your investor to get their money. So incredibly powerful, probably one of the best investments I've made. Mm-hmm. And I do, when I start a job, I will take through from, I suppose, a mentoring and training perspective is whoever works on my team will always know what rebate we're going for, because I would like them to know why they're doing certain things and why we require a certain format so that they get elevated as not just inputting information, but they realize the impact of what they're actually doing. And that has really worked incredibly well. I'm always very excited when one of the requirements of a rebate, if we're going for the producer offset, they require, for instance, an attachment in accounting, because this gives an opportunity to bring somebody along, mentor them, And it's been really rewarding to see how those people have gone out onto other jobs and how they've climbed because they've had the experience of on-the-job training. They're not just in a classroom. They're actually living and feeling and understanding what the work environment is like.
If you had to pinpoint, are there any sort of common mistakes that you've seen producers do that you might highlight so that any producers listening might, before they step into Australia, avoid?
There's certain little things, whereas a silly thing is a public holiday. We might have a public holiday that is relevant to Australia that maybe they weren't aware of. But I think it's just starting that conversation with in the beginning, when you're first exploring, is to have a partner here in Australia who can take you through, some of the requirements that we have. It's more about, finding up front, what are you in for? And then, the rest I think is relatively easy. It's research is important.
Appreciate that. So I just have a few more questions, and I want to go back to Natalie because I know we have a bunch of questions from the audience, and I'll go to Ben first because he was brave enough to sort of highlight this the other day. And I say brave because obviously we're here to promote everything great about Australia, but Ben sort of said, listen, things aren't always perfect, and there are maybe some pros and cons, and maybe those weren't the exact words Ben used, but maybe you can highlight some of the things that producers need to understand or things they need to address, Ben, when they're considering bringing a production to Australia.
Yeah, look, the pros, I guess, are the incentives themselves, that they're backed by the government. And if you think about the location offset and then the stacking of the other incentives that Kat detailed, the exchange rate is the obvious one, although there's a risk that can change. The biggest thing I think that people underestimate is how far Australia is away, so the travel. And even though the producer may say, but that's fine, I have experienced that some actors are reluctant to leave or to be, 4 or 5 hours away from their family, and they're fine to travel to New York, but Sydney was a bridge too far. So the travel and the distance, once you get here, then you need to understand that to go from Sydney to Perth is another 3,000 kilometres. So if you were thinking of a remote location, that those distances need to be understood. It's a different time zone. One of the biggest things we're struggling here is what the rest of the world is struggling with is the increase in costs. So the increase in inputs, not to single out, cast and crew, but there's also fuel and materials are increasing. So, the research on that and the planning, and it may be very well that you have an amazing budget that you did 6 months or 12 months ago, but then that needs to be refreshed to the local reality. And that would lead me to the biggest con, which is probably the con all around the world, is picking those people that you're going to trust, that are going to help you steer the project through whatever it is that you're going to do, probably starting with the UPM or the line producer and trying to work out who can provide that schedule that is realistic for the local conditions. And then those HODs. And it's not that they're not here, because they are most definitely here, but it's the availability. So it's scheduling in when you need to go, when you need to deliver, what are the requirements and the pressure points at the other end for you. And then when you start, to come here naively or even to inquire naively, I'm just, hoping that you can help me. I'm thinking of starting principal photography in 8 weeks. And you think, well, that's fine. If you've got all the money, that's great. So you just bring all the money. And then, of course, they don't have all the money. So there, that's a snapshot, Joe. Does that help, do you think?
Yeah, it does. It does. And so Kat, let's jump to how does EP or how can EP or how does EP helps producers sort of qualify for the location offset and other incentives? How do we help our clients?
So we, as entertainment partners in Australia now, the team here has been working with these incentives since their inception, so back in 2007. We've got a lot of experience. We've lodged over 500 applications to date. So we've seen all of it. We've seen all of the do's, the don'ts, the messes people get into. So what we always say is to come to us as early as possible. As Tracey was saying, you've got to really get started at the beginning. And so engaging us at the beginning, we can help you walk through vetting your budget, setting up for success, just in terms of tagging for your production accounting system. We'll help you understand what documents and data you need to collect through the whole process to make sure that you're doing that from the start. It's terrible to get to your post-production period and try and recreate everything that, it just gets too messy and takes too long. And to Ben's point, that 6 or 9 months, you can cut back if you're really focusing on the incentive. So we'll do check-ins with you throughout pre-production, shoot, post. Our post-production accountants and our incentive teams work closely together just to kind of make sure we're being as efficient as possible to get your incentives into assessment as quick as possible and as complete as possible. So there's no point submitting something for assessment that's not complete. It'll just drag out a lot longer when you're being reviewed for your certificate.
Great. And so before we jump back to Natalie, I just want to ask Jill, so what sets EP's Australian operations apart? What else? And we've talked about incentive support. We've talked about training. What else do we offer our clients in the industry in Australia?
Yeah, so here at Entertainment Partners Australia, we are a bit of a unicorn, not only in Australia, but I think globally. We do provide true end-to-end financial solutions for your show. We can assess the budgets for this territory, provide all of the accounting tech, which we talked about earlier, of course, payroll services, and we also do or source any of the pre-shoot wrap production accounting. We mentor production accountants out on shows. We can do cash flows during pre-production, and we, of course, can wrap doing the post-production. We'll, yes, achieve your training goals and then finally lodge the tax credits.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect way to segue back to Natalie and get some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone. We have a few questions, so we're going to get through as many as we can. I know we're coming to that hour mark, so we may only get to a few, but I'm going to start with one for Ben. So we have a question about co-production advantages between Australia and Canada. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Australia and Canada do have an official treaty. Look, one of the disadvantages is there's no two, Sydney and Toronto are on the other side of the planet. So there is a disadvantage. That's just such a hard question without knowing, is it a film or television? There are advantages to any co-production in that both countries can receive, their own finances, their own rebates. It's a way of levering up, the finance plan. Do you have any specific more details, Natalie, or is it a general question?
I was going to say, we can refer people. We did that really great webinar a few months ago on co-productions, and it talks about, because, a lot of the concepts Ben is talking about is sort of generic, where you're potentially considering an official co-pro. So I don't know, is it on the production lot, Natalie, or is it on ep.com if they wanted to refer back to that webinar?
It is. It's on the production lot and on ep.com. So I will share some details about that once we get to the Q&A.
Natalie, what I would say is that with an official co-production, the biggest advantage on the Australian side is that for official co-productions, the production will automatically be eligible for the producer offset. So if we're talking about a feature film, then automatically we would be eligible for the producer offset for 40% of the Australian qualifying spend.
All right.
So there's an eligibility to the producer offset that comes with an official co-production.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Kat, I'm going to come to you. We have a couple of questions about the specifics. Is there a minimum number of shoot dates that a production needs to meet to qualify for the tax credits?
No, there's not a minimum number of shoot dates, provided that all the other eligibility criteria are met, then they'll qualify.
Perfect. And I know we've talked a little bit about unscripted, but just to verify, the Australian incentives also apply to TV drama, any other type of television production?
Yes, definitely TV drama. Both the producer offset, location, and PDV would cover TV drama. Just to reiterate, with reality, though, that's only the location and PDV offset that would apply to. There are minimum per hour thresholds as well that relate to TV series. So under the location offset, it is 1.5 million per hour that you need to be spending, qualifying spend, in order to be eligible.
All right, thank you. We have an accounting question. So Jill, I'm going to ask this one. Do we remit overseas taxes for cast or crew payroll withholding?
Yes, we absolutely do. What we can't do is provide tax advice, but we can put you into contact with industry tax experts here. But definitely between Entertainment Partners US and Entertainment Partners Australia, we can withhold and lodge tax on either side.
All right, thank you. Ben, I have a question for you. We got a specific scenario about an indie film they are researching in Perth. Their budget is $3.5 million, and they want to know if there's any advice that you have about researching in that area, or is there any dangers they should watch out for?
They should contact the Western Australian Screen Agency, Screen West. I would say that the indie film 3.5 million is at the lower budget end. So certainly they wouldn't be eligible for the location offset because they would be under the threshold. But they could look at the Screen West state incentives. Western Australia does have an additional layer of incentives through I think it's called a regional fund. Mm-hmm. But the first point of call would be to contact the very wonderful people at Screen West. All
right. Thank you. Kat, you mentioned a few times Footloose, and we have a question from the audience. What does that mean? Maybe we need to define it a little.
Okay. So Footloose would just mean that you're not committed to a certain state. So if you're looking to film in Australia, and you absolutely will be filming in Queensland because that is absolutely where you need to be because that's where all your locations are and there's absolutely nowhere else that you could look at, then that wouldn't be considered Footloose. But if you are shopping around to see, where might be the best place for you, then you could talk to any of the state agencies and discuss what might be available to you incentive-wise.
Okay.
And I thought it was the movie Footloose.
I know, that's the first thing.
Everybody loves Kevin Bacon. Yeah.
All right. Since we are at that hour mark, this is going to be our last question. And Jill, I'm going to come back to you. How can our audience get involved with any of the training or the meeting those obligations to make sure that they're qualifying for the offset?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for option one, where you have attachments or interns or mentored accountants, then we can definitely provide those people. And if it's option two, the long-term training program, then we need to put in a provisional certificate together to qualify for that. And so just contact us and we can put your project on that application form.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're at the end of our time. We are reaching that 60-minute mark. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists today. And thank you to our audience who have spent the last hour with us. We do want to let you know that if you happen to have any questions that we didn't get to, or you would like to continue the conversation, we invite you to head over to the production lot. This is our new community site. And there you're going to find discussion forums where you can connect with peers and industry professionals, as well as the experts such as Joe, Kat, Jill, and others from Entertainment Partners. So if we did miss a question, or if you think think of anything else, please head over and post it to the forums, and we'll be sure to get to your questions as quickly as we can. You can also find other things there. You can expand your network. You can access our exclusive content and the latest industry news, exchange ideas. You can find mentors or your next career opportunity. There's a lot there waiting for you, and you can scan the QR code that you see on the screen now, or we can drop a link in the chat and just head over there and get started. And if you are looking for guidance on production incentives, if it's in North America, the UK, Australia, or beyond, please visit us at ep.com/production incentives. There you'll get the latest in incentives news and legislation news. You can explore our interactive tools, including the incentives map, the jurisdiction comparison tool, and the incentives estimator. And our team of experts, some who you met today, are here to ensure that your production gets the best incentive and financing guidance in the industry. So please reach out to us and visit our site, and we would love to help you. A special thank you to our panelists again for joining us today from across the globe, and thank you to you, our audience, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you again at the next Master Series.